Hi, this is George Alger, and welcome to today's segment of Our Ventura TV. Today we're going to be talking about poetry as a catalyst for social change. And our guest is award-winning poet Alan King. Welcome, Alan, and let's just jump into a real fundamental query here. What is poetry?
Well, simply put, poetry is a literary expression in verse. So, unlike prose, poetry has like a different kind of rhythm to it, a different natural rhythm, but it's an expression in verse. And I think one person would say, well, a poet from the DC area that I look up to would say the only difference between a poem and a song is that poetry is there's not always music to it, but a song can be sung. So in simplest terms, I think that's what poetry is.
Very cool. All right, and then what inspired you to get into poetry?
There was a unit in middle school on poetry, and it was rhyming poetry at the time. And I remember enjoying like trying to come up with rhymes at the time. And so that's where I was in the beginning. And then over time, as I continued doing it through college, I was grateful to have other poets that said you should be reading this person, that person to help me continue my growth. So it started in middle school as something fun, and then later on became something that was necessary for myself.
Very good. And you just mentioned rhyming poetry, and I think that it's pretty common to associate rhymes with poems, but is
Hmm.
that, how common is that nowadays?
Ooh. So I can only speak for myself. I know that when I got into poetry, like the understanding that I had of it at the time, it seemed pretty common that was poetry, like it rhyming. But I think it was the more I stayed in the craft, the more I learned and saw what else was possible. I also learned that there were different forms of poetry. So I started out rhyming, but then later on moved into free verse and started learning about other uh, devices or techniques that make a poem a poem. So yeah, but so I can't really say how, I could just say for me in the beginning it was pretty common, and then the more I learned, the more I knew that there were other aspects of it, and that rhyming wasn't the only form of poetry.
Good. All right. Well, thank you. So let's just
Mhm.
dive into the real essence of this conversation. Um, what, what can you say about poetry as a catalyst for social change?
Hmm. So, funny thing is, somebody can say, "Oh, well, prose can be a catalyst for social change," and it would be true. But I think where the difference is between poetry and prose is that, again, poetry being an expression in verse, the form of a poem is a lot smaller than prose, so it usually requires you to get to the point quick. Former teacher of mine, the best way that she defined it was that poetry is a shortcut to empathy. So it's much quicker than prose. And the language, because you don't have a whole lot of space like you would in prose, the language has to be distilled in a way, and so does the emotions or whatever is being expressed. So I think poetry, as a catalyst for social change, helps bring attention to certain things going on around us. I think poetry for as a catalyst for social change, forces us to kind of question things. It could be questioning certain types of authority, questioning the outcomes of certain situations, and then also too within a poem, there are all these other devices that where the poet can make the reader feel any way that they intended for them to feel. So if you can have a poem that can get your readers excited, or it can get them pissed, or it can get them ready to go out and do something. But I think the way that poetry is able to kind of tap into people's emotions, it's a pretty powerful thing. And I think that I've heard too, the same former professor Kate Johnson. I got to quote her on this, but she's the same person that said poetry is a shortcut to empathy. But she, and I remember her also talking about how there are some physiological aspects of poetry. You can hear a certain poem that could awaken or excite some sort of sense, your senses or other aspects of like it can it can awaken your senses to things. And so I think, the ability to be able to tap into people emotionally and get them charged up and ready to make change is a powerful part of poetry being a catalyst for social change.
Good. And can you speak about perhaps some of your work? I mean,
Mhm.
how do you associate yourself as a poet with that concept?
So my style of poems tend to be narrative. And what the way I use the narrative is I use it. So I'll have a point that I want to make, and the narrative itself is just a vehicle to help me drive the point home. And so it's my point, the point that I'm making may not be an easy point to swallow. And so the narrative is, kind of like the flavoring that they put in medication, especially for children. It helps. It's like an extra bit of flavoring that helps, the reader kind of swallow the point, or the point to kind of get in there. But it's, that's been my technique, and it's a technique that, and I'm not the one that came up with this term, but it's a technique known as like the tickle punch poetry. So, if you're going to come with a hard point, you kind of add some humor in there to kind of throw the reader off. And one of my favorite poets, who I think is a master at that, is Tim Siebels. But like, you start off with something, and the reader, who may be kind of like defensive, is like, well, you know what? That's not so bad. Okay, this is, and then boom, they get hit with the point. And then when they start getting defensive again, you kind of like tickle them and kind of open them with some more humor, and then boom. And Tim Siebels, he's one of the people I look up to as a model, but he does it gracefully, and he can keep hammering his point over and over again, but like using humor to kind of throw you off your guard. So that's kind of the approach that I try to go with in my work.
Very good. And speak about the, let's say a particular social change that you would like to see made through, whether it's poetry in general or more specifically your poetry.
So I think the social change that I would like to see is already happening. So like, for example, talking about the George Floyd's murder, and then the reaction to it. And I remember, like, people just talking about the timing of it. It happened, I think, like while the pandemic was going on, while people weren't working, while people were more focused and able to act. And so I think one of the things, 'cause I did actually write a poem about it, but I think one of the powerful things about poetry is that while the desired change is happening, I think too that poetry also, in addition to documenting the event, poetry also, kind of like pokes holes in something, like, okay, what about this possibility? What about this other possibility of change? Like, we have people out marching for George Floyd, but what about this being in addition to that? What about, so I think, poetry, like prose, the at least the way I see it, I think the job of it is just to show the reader, what's possible. It's to give ideas, and then hopefully inspire the reader to take those ideas and kind of run with them.
Good. All right. Well, Alan, we're just about out of time here. I'm wondering if you could, number one, give us a website that viewers can go to for more information. As a matter of fact, if you want to sort of call attention to one of your poems that has to do with social change, mention that too. And also, if you
Okay.
have a summating message for the viewers.
Sure, sure. So my website is alanwking.com, and that's Alan with ALAN. So ALANW King at dot com. Sorry, alanwking.com. And then particular poem I have is probably the most recent one that I wrote, and it was during my second daughter's birth, but it was kind of paralleling her birth with the death of George Floyd, and just how her innocence is like really what we should all be getting back to, but how like we miss our way back to humanity when we justify our own violence. So
Excellent. All right.
thank
Well,
you.
Alan, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And I'm going
Thank
to,
you for having me.
yeah, it's great. So I'm going to wrap things up here. This is George Alger signing off for this segment of Our Ventura TV. Until we meet again.